Hey there fellow painters, today we paint up the Demon Sultan Azathoth for the Cthulhu Death May Die board game. In taking up this challenge I adhere closely to the game art, using purple, green, and orange for a majority of the paint scheme. I dabble in a couple of new techniques such as zenithal highlighting and oil washes, while also demonstrating several different alternatives to these methods that you can use to achieve the same results. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. We begin by applying a white zenithal highlight over the black primer using either a rattle can white primer or a titanium white ink through an airbrush. When using a rattle can for this, I don't attempt to achieve complete opacity on any part of the model. I lightly mist the miniature with white spray paint so that it looks almost gray in appearance. These rattle can paints put out such a high volume of paint that trying to achieve full opacity on select areas of the model isn't really possible without compromising the effect of the zenithal highlight gradually fading into the dark shadow areas. The brightest part of the zenithal is addressed later using a standard brush to apply matte white acrylic paint over the lightly sprayed base of white paint. If using an airbrush, this is a simple one-step process using titanium white acrylic ink. Because the airbrush uses a much more controllable volume of paint output, I can build intense white highlights in specific areas while still allowing the bright white to fade naturally around the edges. And while I'm outside using spray cans, I grab a can of Colonial Red and spray it to the back lower side of the miniature to establish the base for a red OSL backlight effect. To complete the zenithal highlights over the spray can side, I use matte white to paint the brightest highlights in the center of the white spray. I blend this into the surrounding white spray so that the highlights fade naturally into the shadow. This is a time-consuming step, but worth it. I'm also mindful to cover any speckling that occurred during the spray painting step, even if this means extending the highlights farther into the transition area than I would otherwise prefer. Unfortunately, some light speckling is still visible even after this step, but that is a small trade-off if you want to avoid using an airbrush. It should look like this when you're all done. Next, I will quickly cover the model with three main colors for the piece: purple, light green, and orange. There are several ways to accomplish this. I start with some wet blending between the green and purple. I apply the green first, and while it's still fresh, I immediately begin painting the purple adjacent to it, working it gradually into the green so that it blends smoothly between the two colors. This creates a pleasing light brownish orange color in the transition area. I also demonstrate how to achieve this exact same look by simply base layering the two colors next to each other and then using the light green to glaze a transition between the two colors. I continue to apply purple and orange to the model with a standard brush. Finally, I demonstrate how to get the model covered quickly with an airbrush. I begin with purple in the center, and as I work my way out to the extremities, I allow the light green to overlap the purple. Notice how this overlap creates the same light brownish orange color that was achieved with both wet blending and the glazing techniques. The final airbrush step is to add some orange where I feel it's appropriate. I use it to accentuate the rosebud and to add some depth and variety to some of the green bits. One downside of the airbrush is that where different colored features cross over each other, the overspray from the airbrush will require some correction with a standard brush after the fact. No matter how you choose to get this initial layer of paint on the model, it should be done quickly, without much concern for the details. We're going to get this all covered up with a wash, and then we'll spend the majority of our time refining the final presentation. I'm going to make a dark purple oil wash using alizarin crimson and phthalo blue. I use odorless mineral spirits to thin it down a bunch so that it flows smoothly all over the model with very little effort. You can also use the Noosh product by Monument Hobbies to make a similar wash with acrylic paints. There is definitely a trade-off between the two methods. I feel that oil washes are more forgiving to work with. I can literally let this thick coat of oil dry overnight and still be able to easily remove it with a little mineral spirits and a makeup sponge, as demonstrated here. I picked up this package of sponges at Walmart for 99 cents. The downside of an oil wash is that cleanup is a little more of a pain in the ass, and it has a long drying time that extends the time it takes to complete a project like this. The Noosh wash, on the other hand, is cleaner to use, has a faster drying time, and mixes with acrylic paints that you already own. The downside is that the faster drying time makes it less forgiving to work with, and once it's dry, it's dry. I used Noosh when I painted Azathoth, which you can check out here. Now that our dark shadows are in place, the next step is to simply re-establish the brighter base colors. This is focused more on the miniature's right side, meaning our left, where more light would be hitting the mindless lord of Knighted Chaos. In some of the dark recesses that would be affected by light, I glaze some of the lighter colors over the oil wash to decrease the intensity of the shadow so that it more smoothly blends its way into the lighter shades. The orange is used mostly to rim the nether eye. Basically, the entire crinkle star is encircled with this orange. Orange is also used to build upon the transition areas that were created with the green and purple during the base layer step. This orange makes a fine step up from the light brownish orange layer. The purple also is simply brushed over the existing purple areas, taking care not to paint over the orange balloon knot that we just finished. In addition to rebuilding the purple saturation, the purple is used to paint the tongue-like protrusions at the end of the tentacles. For the highlights, a light pale yellow will be added to each of the three main colors. The green definitely takes the longest to highlight simply because of the amount of area it covers all around the miniature. I'm simply painting the highlights on areas that are facing up and left, or the miniature's right side. Mostly I'm focused on all of the edges, ridges, and extreme bends in the extremities that would reflect light coming from the model's right. The final touch for the light green is to add a small amount of highlights with pure ice yellow. A mix of orange and light pale yellow is used to highlight all of the orange bits. I want the Devil's Onion ring to be the main focus of the piece, so I highlight the orange all around the back passage. For the orange areas that are transitions between green and purple, I highlight just near the center of this color transition so that the mix of green and purple is still visible underneath. Highlighting this model is fairly easy due to the amount of texture present. Simply using the side of the brush to drag the highlight color over the raised surfaces and edges makes this step progress rather quickly. Pure ice yellow is used solely to add a final sheen to the rusty sheriff badge. The only purple highlights that require a careful touch are highlights on the tongue-like things at the end of the tentacles. For these, I choose to pinpoint the highlights just on the extreme curves that are facing the light source and the tips of the tongues. The rest of the purple areas are so textured that they are easily edge highlighted with the side of the brush, much like the way the orange areas were highlighted. These purple areas are highlighted in two progressively lighter steps by adding more ice yellow to the existing purple and yellow mix for the second highlight layer. These highlights are added a little more selectively so that we don't obscure all of the previous highlight layer, but build upon it. Finally, a little pure ice yellow is added to the center of the highlights just on the tongue-looking things to make them appear shiny. Lastly, we need to paint the eyes. How many eyes can the blind idiot god have? I count 132 of them. I start with a nice dark base coat of blue-black over the entire eye. This is the most important time to pay attention to the location of the eyes so that you don't miss any of them. Right now they blend into their surroundings so they're easy to miss. Once they have the blue base layer, they will be hard to miss in the upcoming steps. In the character art, it looks like the eyes have some purple undertones, so I'm going to grab a slightly darker purple than I used on the rest of the model and apply it around the outer portion of the eye. I'm not painting it in the center of the eyeball, nor am I painting it to the outer edge of the eye. I just want the purple to be present while still allowing some of the darker blue sections to show through in the eye. Next, I mix a dark blue-gray into the purple. This is the beginning of the highlights for the eyes. I paint a large reflection along the high point of each eye, and I paint a smaller reflection in the bottom portion of the eye that is facing forward. From this point on, the highlights are dabbed and stippled into place so that the reflections have a kind of star cluster appearance as depicted in the character art. As I transition to a light blue-gray highlight, I first mix this color in with the existing purple and blue-gray that's already on my palette. With the highlights already established, it's easy to dot this within the boundaries of the existing reflections. Moving on to the light blue-gray all on its own, I continue adding little dots to the reflections in the eyes. The eyes are the most extensively highlighted part of this model, containing the most highlight layers as we work up to some very bright reflections. Luckily, the surface area of these highlights is so tiny that it doesn't take much time at all. The penultimate highlight is made up of a mix of light blue-gray and some matte white. Nothing to this step but to continue to add smaller and smaller dots to the existing highlights. I feel it's important to save the eyes for the very last step because of how sloppy and free we were with the paint in all of the previous steps. Finally, we turn to some pure Matthew White to add a final glint of light to the many, many eyes. I stole that Matthew White line from another online painter, but I can't for the life of me remember who that painter is. Okay, just 2 more colors to finish up this miniature. First, we'll use some Pyrrole Red to add 1 or 2 little dots to the dark part of each eye. The large eyes get 2 dots, and the smaller eyes get 1 dot. Now, normally I'd want to thin my paint a bit so no texture or brush strokes are left behind, but I'm not doing that here. I overload my brush with paint and just touch the tip of the brush to the eye. I'm perfectly fine with a teeny tiny little mound of red paint within the eye. I don't want to have to repeat this process with multiple coats of red paint. Then, while I have the red on the palette, I intensify the red OSL on the back side of the Mini. I'm basically just applying this with a very light dry brush over most of the area, and then I brush on more opaque layers closer to the bottom of the miniature. Back to the eyes, I follow up the red with an even smaller amount of orange. These orange dots are placed inside the red dots. I don't need to apply the orange as thick as I applied the red, since the orange shows up nicely against the red background color. And that, my friends, is the finishing touch for this miniature. If you made it this far, let me know what you think of the brighter color scheme of this miniature as compared to some of the darker models that I've painted for this game. If you didn't make it this far, then who am I even talking to right now? Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.